Hello and welcome to the Global Perspective Show. I'm John Bercia, Special Assistant to the President for Global Perspectives. Our guest today is Dr. Sebastian Gorka, who was the founder of the Institute for Transitional Democracy and International Security in Budapest, currently teaches at the National Defense University. Welcome, Dr. Gorka.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us.
You're welcome.
Tell us a little bit about your background before we get into specific questions and some of the historical connections that you have to events in Hungary specifically.
Sure. My family, both my parents were born in Budapest, and my father, after World War II, as a young undergraduate at university, decided that the terms of the peace treaty that settled World War II were not being observed by the new regime, the communist regime that had taken over the country. And he created a secret resistance movement amongst his fellow colleagues at university. Unfortunately, after a few months, the network became known to a certain Kim Philby in Britain, who today we know is one of the most effective and dangerous spies the KGB ever had in the British Secret Service. And as a result, my father and his colleagues were betrayed. He received a life sentence, age of 20, was put in a political prison. And then, lucky for me, because otherwise I wouldn't be here, he was released. He was rescued from prison by the revolutionaries in 1956. And he found out there's an escaped political prisoner. He was on a shoot-to-kill list. And so he left the country a few weeks later with the daughter of one of his fellow prison mates, who would become his wife and my mother. And as a result, I was born and grew up in the United Kingdom as the child of political exiles. And finally, thanks to the geostrategic events that occurred a few years ago, I was allowed to go back to Hungary, the land of my family. And I worked for the first democratically elected government, the Defense Department of Hungary, for 5 years after the fall of communism. So it's not an unusual story for that part of the world, but I guess it kind of has an influence on the way one sees things internationally.
Absolutely. And no doubt that had some effect on your decision to establish the institute that we mentioned at the beginning of this discussion. Tell us a little bit about that, what its goals and interests are.
The goal of the Institute is fundamentally a product of my professional interests, which is national security, and my research focus, which has been since September the 11th, the necessity for radical reform of the way we think about national security in the post-Cold War environment. So personally, for the last almost 10 years, I've been looking at how the architecture all of our countries have to protect our citizens doesn't match the threat environment. We are well built to protect ourselves from other nations as nation states. Things like Al-Qaeda, organized crime such as in Mexico, or even global warming or AIDS, are all linked by one thing. They have nothing to do with the nation state. They do not originate from the nation state. They are transnational and most often non-state actors. So personally, I was interested in creating a think tank that looks at those issues.
Tell us where you were in terms of the whole terrorism studies area in the period preceding 9/11. There was about a decade in there following the end of the Cold War where a lot of this was coming together. Most people, including in this country, were not paying any attention to those developments. What was the downside of that attitude?
Well, I fell into the topic almost by accident. As an undergraduate, there was a young man I knew in the halls of residence who every other weekend would disappear for 2 days, and he'd never tell us where he was going. And once I pestered him so much, he said, well, do you really want to know? Well, come with me. And I went with him, and as a result, I was selected to join something called the Territorial Army, the British Reserves, the equivalent of the National Guard. So as an undergrad, I joined a unit of the military intelligence of the British Reserves. And this unit had a counter-terrorism mandate, which was, of course, specifically back then in the early 90s, the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, looking at their tactics, trying to work out how they would attack British assets in Northern Ireland and elsewhere. So that's by way of my indoctrination into the field. Then I was very fortunate in the late 90s to receive a fellowship to come to the Kennedy School in Boston. And after my first year there, I had to find a job to pay the rent in the summer vacation. And I managed to win a position at the RAND Corporation. And I'm not sure how familiar you may be with the internal functioning of something like the RAND Corporation, but there it's very un-European. It's not a collection of individuals who are the experts on the field. Everybody has to be a jack of all trades there, because you have to work very quickly to order to the federal government to provide answers and analysis. I was forced to return to the issue of terrorism, not just European security. And I did some work there on the question of weapons of mass destruction, which was one of the fields America actually paid attention to in the 1990s. But to the main thrust of your question, the issue was, for me, from the grand strategy perspective, the international perspective, the 1990s was fundamentally what a colleague of mine calls a decade of strategic confusion and frustration. The Cold War was very, we're often nostalgic for the Cold War because it was very simple to understand. You knew who the enemy was, you knew where they were located, and you could access sensitive information through your intelligence agencies relatively easily. You knew the Kremlin was important, you knew the headquarters of the Second General Army in Moscow was where the big decisions were being taken about a potential Third World War. But in the 1990s we lost all that certainty. I'm not sure you'd agree with this, but for me, the Cold War could be summed up in two words in terms of Western national and security policy, and that's containment policy. Keep the enemy ideology of communism within the current geographical area that it is in. In the 1990s, we didn't have that threat assessment. What were our armed forces, our intelligence agencies, there to protect us from? So you had all kinds of concepts, the very famous theories of Huntington, Fukuyama, Kagan, and others. And terrorism was just one of many threats on a laundry list that included ethnic cleansing, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, rogue states, failed states. And as a result, we lost focus. It was very hard to make a convincing argument in Congress or elsewhere that this is what you have to invest in, this is the threat. And as a result, that's one of the reasons I think 9/11 caught us so by surprise here in America.
What was your reaction initially to 9/11? Was it something you had anticipated in a broad sense without those specifics, or was it something that you thought would not happen?
Well, if you look at the evolution of terrorism, or what we like to call more specifically political violence, one of the things that you realize very soon, if you look at the history of this phenomena, is that unfortunately this is something analogous to theft, murder, lying, prostitution. It's something that has always existed since there have been human communities, and unfortunately will always exist. So it's not something that you can eradicate. Whatever system you're living in, there will always be a minority of individuals who think they have the right to use violence against those people who they disagree with for their own political or religious ends. So I had no expectation in the 1990s that terrorism would disappear. Of course, those organizations that had enjoyed support for ideological reasons from the Soviet Union, such as certain Arab groups, Baader-Meinhof, the IRA, and so forth, those organizations had a tough time in the 1990s because there was no Soviet Union to bankroll them anymore. There's a very famous military strategist called von Clausewitz, and he says something about war which I think pertains also to terrorism. He says, the nature of war is immutable, it never changes, but its characteristics and its shape are ever changing. I think the same can be said of terrorism. For the word to mean something meaningful, the essence of terrorism, the use of violence by a minority against the legitimate majority, never changes. But the context it occurs in, the reasons, the motivations people justify it by, and especially with 9/11 specifically, the methods the terrorists use are always changing. It's not just the gun and the bomb. Today it's finding innocent technologies that can be used to kill masses of people within a matter of minutes. So I wasn't surprised by the continued threat of terrorism, but I don't think anybody can say beyond certain authors in the world of fiction like Tom Clancy, who were rather prescient in terms of how 9/11 would occur. I don't think many people in government can claim that they saw 9/11 coming.
And yet, you can go back to the mid-1970s and find references in theoretical discussions to the use of aircraft as weapons, and aircraft were favorite tools of terrorists during that period for hijacking purposes. But I remember having a conversation with Dr. Stephen Sloan, who was our Chastang Fellow of Terrorism Studies here at the University of Central Florida and a longtime colleague of yours, about discussions in planning sessions as early as 1991, 1992, in which they specifically talked about the possibility of aircraft being directed into iconic structures as part of the evolving terrorist strategies. So if we were thinking about those possibilities and talking about them, wouldn't it have made sense that we would have put into place defenses that would have made it more difficult for those types of acts to occur? At a relatively low cost?
You're being far too rational. And federal government and rationality don't often go together, as I'm sure you know. Why was it, for example, that the 9/11 hijackers knew full well that if they used physical force on one of the attendants, that immediately they would be allowed access to the cockpit? Because they knew the regulations of the FAA, that the official federal policy of the United States and almost every international airline was that if force is used inside an airborne aircraft carrying civilians, you immediately comply with the demands of the terrorist. That was the standing operating procedure. Why? Because the threat assessment was based upon the 1970s and 80s, where hijacking was the threat, taking people to another place they didn't want to go for a political demand to be made public to the world, release of prisons or whatever. So they based it on the last war. They based it on the last conflict. Now it's different. Now you can't. I flew here just a few hours ago. The second the door on the plane closes, you see that steel cockpit door close, and that door does not open, not even to the hostesses, unless that plane is safely landed. So there is this description of democracy as the 800-pound gorilla, and I tend to agree with this. The whole point of democracy is it's not an authoritarian regime. The only place you don't have terrorism is in a totalitarian country like Stalin's Soviet Union, where you can penetrate the whole society with secret police and informants. In a democracy, unfortunately, it takes a crisis. It often takes an awful disastrous event for us to take the adequate measures to deal with a new threat. It's the large gorilla that's very happy to sit there calmly eating its bananas in a relaxed mode. But if you make it angry, it will take action. And that's one of the strengths or perhaps weaknesses of our democratic system, and the 19 hijackers from Al-Qaeda were well aware of it. So some people had the imagination, but the disjunction is between those like Professor Sloan, who I know and admire deeply, and the federal government. Who would have taken it seriously? Who would have said, well, now every airline has to spend millions of dollars changing its infrastructure? Nobody could have convinced the democratic government to do that.
Well, 9/11 occurred, and we have been in a post-9/11 mode with a variety of strategies advanced and activities undertaken since then. What has worked and what hasn't worked, in your opinion? And what do you say to people who refer to 9/11 as unique and say, well, nothing of that magnitude has happened since then, therefore things must be under control?
What has worked is probably one of the most important questions for the new administration to answer, I think, and I'm glad that you raise it. I think it's a mixed story. There are some great successes, and there are still some very problematic institutional obstacles. Let's start with the successes. The mere fact that an organization like Al-Qaeda, which by CIA and German foreign intelligence estimates had 50,000 people go through its training camps during the 1980s, an organization of at least several thousand individuals has failed repeatedly to execute any type of attack, let alone a mass casualty attack on the mainland of the United States, has to be put down as a success. The fact that numerous cases or plots have been intercepted, whether it's the Fort Dix plot or whether it's the numerous plots in Europe and elsewhere, shows that we are doing something right. I think what are we doing right? We have understood that national security is not about tanks and aircraft carriers in the third millennia. Those are important for various missions, but it's about law enforcement, and it's about intelligence, and it's about community policing. The idea that in 47 or 45 of the US states today, if you are stopped by a police officer who is a state or local representative, not a federal representative, if he puts your identity into his little laptop in his cruiser, that within milliseconds your name is sent to a terrorist threat list in the national archives, in the databases in Washington, and within seconds he gets a reply as to whether you're on a terror watch list. I think that is something where we can demonstrate a technical advance has been made, and I don't think you could say that's a negative in terms of civil liberties. What are the problems? I think the biggest weakness we have is that we have underestimated how much this current conflict, whatever we wish to call it, I know the President will soon rename this conflict. We know it's no longer to be termed a global war on terrorism. Whatever the new acronym, whatever the new name is, we need to finally, after 8 years, take seriously the ideological aspects of this war. It's not just about criminals who want to do us harm. It's not just about evil people or murderers, and it's definitely not about crazy people. These individuals have a strategy. They're very rational in their strategy. Their form of logic is not our form of logic, but they have a logic. And as a result, we have to understand that one of the most powerful tools they have is a very coherent ideology of a global reformation through violence of a twisted version of the Muslim faith. And we have to understand that many of their messages resonate with people in the world who are either simply bystanders or quietly sympathetic. When bin Laden spoke in his videotape in October of 2001 about the Palestinian cause, there are many people in the world who can relate to that. They can't relate to 3,000 people being killed in New York or Washington, but they can relate to somebody calling for an independent or free Palestine. That's an ideological weapon he is using. We can only beat an ideology with a better one. And that's what we did in the Cold War. We said liberty, democracy, freedom of choice, and free markets are morally better, qualitatively better than a one-party state system and a command economy. I truly think it wasn't SDI, it wasn't Star Wars, it wasn't the economics, it wasn't the military build-up that broke the Soviet Union. It was because our vision of the future was morally better than the vision that the Kremlin gave the world. We need an ideology that is better and is morally more promising than that of people like Osama bin Laden.
And is that part of what you discussed today as you provide your current assessment of the terrorism threat and what we might do in response?
Yes, some of the work I've been doing in recent months at the National Defense University is to look at specifically what lessons learned remain, what tools we can reinvigorate from prior ideological conflicts. One of the things we seem to forget that not only was the Cold War an ideological conflict, but to a very great extent, so was the last hot war we fought, so was World War II. And back then, the ideological element, the message of what we stood for, what the West stood for, in contrast to what the Third Reich stood for what the Imperial Japanese forces stood for. That was a crucial element, and Britain and the US worked very closely together to make sure that the message was broadcast not only to their own people in terms of morale building, but also to the broader audience of allies, potential allies or fence sitters. So my research today looks in large part at how we can go back to those tools, how we can, what is today termed strategic communications, how we can better our strategic communications for our own audiences and for the global audience of people out there who want to see what America represents.
What would be the advice that you'd offer to the average person, some of the people watching this program, about what they should think about when the terrorism issue comes up? How should they feel about the terrorist threat today? What should they do in their personal lives? Not in a way that they become afraid, but in a way that they become more aware of the issue.
I definitely, any good definition of terrorism has an element that talks about the inculcation of fear. The terrorist wants to make a lot of people afraid, as well as harming people and killing people. So there's definitely no room here for us to be fear-mongers. However, let me give you an example. The IRA, which is one of the most effective, deadly terror organizations of the 20th century. When I was a young boy growing up in the United Kingdom, the IRA was at one of its deadliest points in its development. And the IRA, in a course of 30 years, killed less than 3,000 people. So I'm just trying to get the base point here. Al-Qaeda killed more people in 102 minutes 8 years ago. So the IRA was less dangerous than Al-Qaeda, but even so, because the IRA was deliberately targeting civilians, when I grew up as a young man, as a young boy in London, you could not travel on public transport, be it a bus or a train or a metro or subway, and see an unattended bag, even a plastic carrier bag, sit with nobody next to it on a train or a bus for literally more than 30 seconds before a bystander would ask, who is this? Whose is this? And when nobody claimed it, that bus, that train would be stopped, the police would be called, it would be investigated, and the potential threat dealt with. So basically, what I think is important to understand, without everybody thinking we're under constant attack, is what we call in national security situational awareness, that you simply take responsibility for yourself. We are in a democracy, and a democracy provides liberties and freedoms that other systems do not. And as a result, you need to take your own personal security as partially your own responsibility. We don't stand policemen next to every citizen. In the US, you have very special posse comitatus requirements that say we don't use federal forces, armed forces, internally. Therefore, who's responsible for your safety first? It's you. So make sure that, especially as the head of a family, that, for example, I would say, have a plan if something goes wrong. Any good plan will protect you from a potential terrorist attack and also a natural disaster. If you think of what happens in California every year with forest fires and all kinds of other natural disasters, having water, having a medication, a spare set of glasses, these are all very simple things. Every family can do them. Always having a flashlight. It's not simply the effect of having a capability to look after yourself. Once you start doing this, you have a mental edge, and you start to take responsibility in a way that denudes the enemy of their power over you.
Good. Well, on that note, we'll conclude. Thank you very much, Dr. Gorka.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
And thank you for the Global Perspective Show. I'm John Garcia, and we'll see you next time.